Um, Good morning. I am also very happy to be here and grateful for the conference and for yeah, being here. An innocent listener or a listener unwilling to change their unchallenged, innocuous position towards the opera unfolding in front of them will likely find this particular work by Saariaho unsettling. The opera's appellation to a subject of political and psychological urgency made Alex Ross in New Yorker highlight its psychological thriller components. The shift toward topicality for Saariaho, who, quote, rose to fame by employing modernist and avant-garde techniques to summon otherworldly, dreamlike spheres, unquote. Far from being an innocent opera girl, I nonetheless share a surprise. How did it happen that Saariaho composed an opera on school shooting? What aspects of her previous creative experience led her to this choice? Even with Adriana Mater in her background, her focus on a key tragic plot of our time, happening so frequently in real life, and so heatedly discussed, debated by modern citizens and their governments, may still seem perplexing. Pondering the composer's commitment to exploring this subject, I found one of the clues to expanding it in the composer's public appearances. One was an interview with James Joly in March 2023, and another a conversation between Kaija Saariaho, Sophie Oksanen, and Alexei Barrière at Finnish National Opera in October 2022. Saariaho, we learn, was interested in, quote, how the group of people live one event so differently. But what she imagined was, quote, a group of tourists coming to see Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, unquote. I have found only one Anglophone review that mentioned this proto-concept. There are probably far more in Finnish and other languages. It is in the New York Times, and the review, Zachary Walls, writes, Saariaho gave it the working title Fresco. It was inspired, she has said, by the Last Supper, from which she derived the size of the cast, 13 soloists, and the piece's broader questions of culpability, and the linked yet separate experience of people who have shared a trauma. Wolf referred to Joshua Baron's report from the rehearsal room, where he quoted Saariaho's words. I was thinking about how all of these 13 people have their own story and their own motivations, and how we all experience every moment differently. We all pay attention to different things. This became a kind of idée fixe for me. I would like to emphasize the word we in her statement. We all experience. To me, this is as important as her concept of the experiential difference. As I am going to prove today, the composer's initial concept, a multilingual group contemplating Da Vinci, has made a momentous impact on her final work, 13 characters united by the extraordinary experience. I argue that The Last Supper provides a key to the interpretation of the opera that may have otherwise remained hidden by the topical subject matter. Its foundational gospel story gives a new dimension to the plot of sacrifice and mourning, in particular of Pietà. Innocence explores the tragedy that has already happened, with Saariaho forcing us to revisit the traumatic event again and again. In terms of musical genre, it brings us to the Passion. Linked both to Da Vinci and the Passion is a key dramaturgical feature of Saariaho's opera, that of tableau unfolding in parallel time streams. To begin my confirmation of this thesis, I will refer to Saariaho's definition of her work as well as the opera creator's description of their process. First, the definition. Saariaho wanted to name the entire project Fresco, explaining its gist in the composer's note as following. Under its disguise of the thriller, Innocence is a story about recovery and healing, a large fresco of the human mind. Then the creator's explication. I wanted a group of people living through something extraordinary and the consequences. Kaija Saariaho. Kaija had this idea that there would be 13 characters who are united by an event. Alexei Baruch. Kaija wanted to be multilingual and that all the performers to be on the stage throughout the piece. Sophie Oksanen. Summarizing this pronouncement, we can see that Innocence had calculated around 4 structural points. An extraordinary, possibly traumatic experience. 13 characters brought together by this experience. The idea of the performance being present on stage for the duration of the piece. And the characters' multilinguality. In my opinion, by linking this concept of the opera to the idea of the fresco, and especially the fresco by Leonardo, we discover that at the core of Saariaho works lies a visual image that defines not only the emotional outlines of this musical and theatrical text, but also its structural essence. Okay. When Saariaho envisions a stage on which 13 characters are present all the time, she alludes to the timeless, canonical, but also static trope, the figure of Jesus and the apostles gathered for the Last Supper in Leonardo's fresco. The idea of something tragic and yet unerasable from collective memory is reflected in the opera in one way or another. The visuals and the underlying theological text help us understand how, while Da Vinci fresco remained on the composer's mind, Saariaho, Oksanen, and Baruch transformed the ideas of catharsis, multilinguality, and other common trauma into a storyline about the school shooting. Next, I will go through the major elements of the plot, the Pietà, 13 characters, the passions, and so on. The foundation gospel story of the Last Supper gives a new dimension to the plot of sacrifice and mourning, in particular the Pietà. Saariaho emphasized her deep connection to the figure of the grieving mother in her composer's note. From a young age, I have imagined the life of those mothers who see their children become marginal outsiders, maybe homeless, in spite of the love and care they have been given. Imagining those feelings is one emotional source for this new opera, one of the many facets of the collective trauma as the one we wanted to examine. Earlier, Saariaho explored the subject of motherhood and violence in Adriana Mater. As Yaoi Una Everett noticed in her Reconfiguring Myth and Narrative in Contemporary Opera, Peter Sellers' staging of the opera brought to the front a modern view of Adriana as Mater della Rosa, a suffering Madonna. It is not accidental that the two central characters of Innocence, Teresa and Marchetta, are a mother mourning her child and her daughter killed in the shooting. As far as I understand, the composer made a choice of the singers for the roles, Maddalena Casena and Vilma Jahr, before the parts were written. In fact, the parts were apparently composed specifically for them or with them in mind. While Casena's voice and performance style is not as distinctive as Vilma Jahr's, Saariaho studied her manner of speaking in order to create the role. Of course, I also should note that Teresa's grief in Innocence at certain moments spills over into rage. Next, 13 characters. Saariaho wanted 13 characters, and she wanted them to be on stage all the time. Thus, she imagined them to be taken in by the audience at one glance, as the viewer takes in Christ and 12 apostles, as depicted on the fresco. In Innocence, 13 characters are divided into groups: the wedding participants and the survivors, who first appear in the aftermath scenes. While the opera is set in the 2000s, as we read in the libretto, each group of 6 exists in its own time. And I tried to show it. The wedding takes place on a particular summer evening in the now, or the present, or the operatic time. The time frame of the aftermath is open, but is still in the 2000s, as libretto says, and I would define it as past then, after the tragedy, past the shooting. In grammatical terms, we can refer to it as present perfect continuous, the tense marking such a sentence as I have been doing. Finally, Innocence unfolds in some kind of third time, wherein the characters of the aftermath get transferred in the middle of the opera. That time is then, the simple grammatical past, the day of the shooting. Two central characters, mother and daughter, Teresa and Marchetta, function as intermediaries between these two groups and times or tenses. Teresa appears only in the wedding scenes, thus belonging only to the present. That said, mentally, Teresa seems to be constantly in her own aftermath. This in-betweenness and the fact that she sees the ghost of her daughter sets her apart from all other characters at the wedding. But since she was not a witness of the shooting, she doesn't belong to the survivors either. Marchetta, in her turn, is radically different from everyone else, not only because of her folk voice and manner. She's the only one who hasn't survived. She's not among the living. Marchetta exists only in the past, appearing in the present only as a ghost. This is how the composition of Innocence looks on my scheme: 6 plus 6 living characters and 1 deceased. Please note, I do not mean to liken Marchetta to Jesus, but I do suggest that this composition is the composition of the Last Supper. In fact, they can see that this is how Saariaho composed or painted the fresco of Innocence. For her, Da Vinci's work provided not only overall number of the characters, 13, but also the idea of how to group them and how to organize the chronological pattern of the entire work. In short, the Last Supper underlines the entirety of opera's structure. In exploring the opera further, we will address its plot and the arcs of the characters on whom Saariaho relied for the advancement of the narrative action. Here I am going to make the following points. Innocence explores the tragedy of the shooting as it had already happened. There is constantly reiteration of the idea that the central character will be or was killed. The audience is invited to return to this tragedy endlessly. We relive it over and over again. Because Christ's self-sacrificial death is a moment that unfolds in theological time, that is, on the calendric scale, it gets repeated year after year after year, with Easter as the culmination of the believer's veneration of it. These points apply both to Innocence and the Last Supper. Thus, Saariaho's emphasis on the idea of eternal, outside of time, return to the day of shooting, and Marchetta's death, reveals another aspect of the visual, narrative, and philosophical framework that the Da Vinci fresco provide. In terms of the philosophical idea at the core of this subtextual interaction, we're witnessing mourning at its deepest and most orthodox. But in terms of music, all these features, coupled with the gospel story of the Last Supper, bring us to the genre of passion. Saariaho's interest in it was revealed previously in La Passione de Simone. Discussing Bach passions in their listener, Marcus Reti included an image from Abraham Wigner's book, Necessary Occupation on a Friday. That illustration, quote, provided the reader with a variety of material to contemplate the death of Christ at home, unquote. The biblical narrative, meditative texts, and hymns. Wigner's volume was printed in 1724, the year when St. John Passions was performed. And I cannot help but notice that the performance occurred exactly on April 7, which 302 years ago happened to be a Good Friday. The first engravings in Wigner's book differed from the other 51 that depicted scenes from the Bible. It doesn't show the pictures. And we didn't check it somehow. Okay, it will be only description of Reti. Reti comments, in the foreground, he says, sorry. In the foreground, we see a figure that is not part of the Passion story. It is a woman in a long dress. The woman represents the faithful believer. She's clearly not a part of the narrative. She is not even part of Jesus' time. She becomes a part of the story by beholding and meditating on suffering of Christ. In both Bach's Passions, Reti argues, the interpretation of the biblical texts in arias and recitatives follows the hermeneutic principle of asking, what does it mean for me? Why and how are the historical events relevant for the contemporary listener? The image from the Wigner's book as a visual representation of this principle tells us that believer became a beholder of the events, and her heart was stirred by what she observed. A listener of passion was not supposed to stay aloof. Active participation was in order. Giving us an example of such engagement, Reti quotes nothing other than the scene of the Last Supper from St. Matthew's Passion by Bach. Jesus celebrates Passover with his disciples and announces to them that one of the 12 will betray him. The evangelist reports, and they became very distressed and started, each and every one among them, to say to him, Lord, am I the one? The short turbe chorus is followed by the chorale, which includes the contemporary believers in these conversations, says Reti. And since a hymn stanza commonly the voice of the congregation, Reti concludes, while the disciples in the historical narrative are still pondering the question of who might be the betrayer, the Christian congregation confesses its responsibility for the suffering and death of Christ. "'Tis I should atone." I argue that bearing responsibility for a tragedy is a main message of Innocence. Just like Bach's Passions, the opera has in its center the idea of collective trauma or collective guilt, along with the concepts of repentance and redemption. And it's precisely in the comparison with Da Vinci's Fresco and Bach's Passions that this ideological or theological foundation of Saariaho's opera manifests itself so clearly and fully. Who is to blame, the opera asks? The shooter, his friends, his family? While the opera characters debate this question, the answer can be found in the Passion. This is the Vinci Code of Innocence, the imperative addressed to every listener in the audience. 'Tis I should atone. There is no equivalent to the hymn stanza in the libretto of Innocence. That said, I'm still going to insist that there is an equivalent to the chorale in the opera. In the statement quoted above, Saariaho said, quote, "Imagining those feelings is one emotional source for this new opera. One of the many facets of the collective trauma is one we wanted to examine and for which we developed a choral form. A choral cloud appears in many scenes. I suggest that these choral passages serve to express the voice of community and therefore of the audience, comparable to how chorales function in Bach's Passion. Again, we may discover a similarity with the chorus in Ariadne that Una Everett defines as, quote, ritualistic framework in which to absolve the four characters from trauma, rage, and collective guilt. The chorale is a musical clue that allows me to go back to discussing the structure of Innocence, or to be precise, the emergence in the opera of multiple narrative layers, which expand and complicate already complex dual time and storyline. Saariaho's choral passages in the role of chorals makes us connect the dual timeline in the Innocence with the dual time in Bach's Passions, namely the historical time of the event from the Gospels in recitatives and turbe, and the time of reaction to them in arias and chorales. John Eliot Gardiner raises questions about the timeline of this response. Where are we now? Is this an historical event or a reaction to it? If the latter, by whom? Jesus' disciples, the daughter of Zion, the Christian community, or mankind as a whole? And when are things occurring? In the 1st century AD, in the Lutheran time frame of the chorale, in the 1720s, 30s, and 40s of Bach's Leipzig congregation, or in the present, as they affect us now? I suggest that, like Gardiner listening to Bach, we cannot define the time of the choral passages in our response to Innocence. Rather, we can say that Saariaho's chorales, as the time of reaction to events in Bach's Passion, can be ours. Of course, in Innocence, there is no time gap between the events unfolding on stage and our reaction, but the chronology of how we counter still differs from the time of action on stage. Therefore, besides experiencing the stage times, we also live through the time of the choral passages, inferred, revealed only to our ears, which is our time, the time of our reaction to the musical event in its ideological, theological, psychological, and other implications. I have illustrated the timelines of Innocence on yet another scheme. But before showing it, I want to direct your attention to the overall structure of the opera, which is also linked, in my opinion, to the Passion and Da Vinci's Fresco. Innocence is given subtitle, an opera in 5 acts. It seems to adhere to traditional structure, acts divided into scenes, but one gets a sense that the sequence of smaller structural units in Innocence is more important, especially since in theatrical practice, short operas are performed without being divided into acts, let alone 5 acts. At the Met, as probably on other world stages, it is performed without an intermission. We might say that the 5 acts of Innocence bear symbolic significance, drawing on the long French tradition from Jean-Baptiste Lully through Meyerbeer to Debussy. But in my experience, which was proved yesterday at the Metropolitan Opera, what we are following when we are listening to Innocence are scenes, not acts. Let me note that this subdivision into smaller sense is characteristic of Saariaho's works for the theater. Adriana is an opera in 7 scenes, tableaux, which are given titles, and this division is no less, if not more, important than its division into 2 acts. La Passione di Simone consists of 15 stations, while Innocence consists of 25 scenes, as you can see on this schematic illustration. The opera adheres to that dual timeline I mentioned earlier, with the scenes of the wedding alternating with scenes of the aftermath. As I have tried to prove just now, each timeline has its own characters, which remain a distinct group. The wedding characters stay in the same time and place, with an exception of scenes 23 and 4, where the timelines overlap. Conversely, starting with scene 9, survivors move back to the day of shooting, which I showed with the red color. So wedding is gray, green is aftermath, and red is then, the past, the day of shooting. Marchetta, as I also pointed out before, stands apart from everybody else. She doesn't appear in the aftermath, and she joins survivors only in the shooting scenes, in the past. This sequence of scenes, in my opinion, demonstrates that the structure of Innocence is perceived, or maybe was conceived, not as a 5 acts divided into 4 or 5 scenes, but rather as scenes grouped into acts. The plot unfolds from scene to scene. There are no watersheds between the acts except for the interlude between acts 2 and 3. This principle of developing a composition from many smaller elements that are then combined with others, again, in my opinion, has a prototype in oratorio Passions. John Eliot Gardiner suggested that there is, quote, an ample precedent for dividing up the gospel narrative into separate acts. Gardiner considers Johann Jakob Bendeler's proposed division of Matthew accounts into 6 principal actions. Quote, he considered a helpful way of tracing the Passion's structural outline, although Bach's autograph indicates no such clear subdivisions. What I find especially interesting in our context, that Gardiner compares this structure with a tragédie lyrique by Rameau, comprising a prologue and 5 acts divided into scenes. This structure is remarkably well suited to Innocence. 5 acts of French operatic tradition, without prologue but with epilogue, and even the number of scenes quite similar, 25 in Innocence versus 28 in St. Matthew Passions. I will have the problem with the last part of my talk because it will not show you the pictures, but you're welcome to see it on my laptop, because the last part I devoted to Innocence in the context of 21st century Passions. I planned, but I do not have time to discuss Wolfgang Riem's Deus Passus 2000 and David Lang's Little Match Girl Passions 2007 as 2 examples that bring the Passion story to life for today's listener. But I would like to consider the staging of Bach's St. Matthew Passion by Romeo Castellucci as a parallel to Innocence. Castellucci staged his La Passione in 2016 when Kaija Saariaho was working on Innocence. I find it interesting to compare how the Regi Opera, director's opera, interprets the Baroque work in the modern context, while the new opera interprets the archetypal model of the Passion. In the quote above, John Eliot Gardiner asked where that responsive listener of Bach passions might be. And it turned out that he could have been present throughout the entire 2000-year history of the passions, or at the very least from the 1720s, when Bach interpreted them and his first listeners heard them, right up to the present day, when it affects us. But we're different from those who listened to Bach's Passion 300 years ago. Again, to the dual time of the Passion, we need to add a third time, our own. Romeo Castellucci argues that it is impossible to narrate or depict the Passion story for today's audience. Instead, he suggests that we must find contemporary metaphors capable of evoking the same feelings that Bach's music and text evoked back then. He proposes images that should have the same impact today as, he believes, the biblical story in Bach's music did back then. So, yes, we do have poems. So I will just show several objects, several images which he chose. In the interview titled The Viewer and Their Pain, Romeo Castellucci explains his approach. He says, you cannot, you can no longer bring the gospel to the stage today the way it was done back then with a sacra representazione. We all know its external history, but it is brought to life only through the narrator's descriptions of horror, existential fear, surprise, and shame. And these emotions are reflected in the audience. This perspective is conveyed in my production. It is the objects that evoke these emotions that poetry is intended to evoke in the viewer. I have sought to create objects that not only convey the sense of the derailment, chaos, and disorder that pervades Pikander's poetry, but also the pain or the passion that pours over the viewer. Images do not depict the passion of Jesus, but rather that of the ordinary person. I would therefore say that through this scenic process, Jesus' passion becomes the passion of the viewer of humanity. Here too, I see the interaction between the archetypal, the classical, and the contemporary. Castellucci chooses shocking images in order to show the listener, who over the course of their life has grown accustomed to the harmony and beauty of Bach's music, that it speaks of suffering, of wounds, of crucified body bleeding to death. Conclusion. Castellucci lay bare the searing pain hidden beneath all too familiar Baroque music, and conversely revealed that behind the modern, banally horrific situations, that there are archetypal images of betrayal, doubt, and torment. This, in my view, is what connects this production to Innocence. Gardiner argued that Bach, quote, since he is not catering for a passive opera theater audience, but rather a Lutheran congregation eager for spiritual nourishment, can count on a degree of active participation from his listeners as they find themselves inexorably drawn into the fabric of the drama. This allows him to set rough questions for them. Contemporary opera, contemporary theater, contemporary art in general see it as their mission to ask uncomfortable questions and provoke an audience reaction. And here, Innocence converges strikingly with Passions. From the idea of building a plot around Da Vinci fresco, Kaija Saariaho moved on to creating her own fresco. Who is standing in front of this fresco. 'Tis I, 'tis us, we stand there, just as a modern person stands before Da Vinci's fresco or listens to Bach's Passion. And consequently, it is we who must share the trauma and guilt for what happened, share the compassion and repentance. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you very much for deciphering the Da Vinci Code. I just want to give a couple elements to complement what you said. One thing that I think is important to relativize the content of the chosen image is that in the early stages, we talked about multiple different frescoes as possible like crystallizing images. And they had in common of being displayed publicly and have being the possibility of having this international group next to the image. And the other images we talked about were the Sistine Chapel and the Zimri-Lim fresco at the Louvre, Syrian fresco from antiquity. And so I think it was very important that why Leonardo's fresco became very important, of course, because of it contains this notion of trying to identify the guilty person in the image, and it's a very thriller-like image. It's very unusual in Last Supper images to display Judas in the middle instead of having him at the end of the table. So I think this element of investigation that there was in the image was very important also as a narrative device when we came up with the structure of the opera. And the other thing is, of course, that when we looked for reference for the amount of characters, thank God we didn't use the Sistine Chapel, which has hundreds of characters on the ceiling. So the ratio that was offered by Leonardo's Last Supper was very important for us. And the third thing is that we had this immediate association between this image and wedding pictures and the secrets that are hidden behind wedding pictures. And that was, let's say, the primary trigger for developing the story. So, but starting from there, we did seek actively to undermine the Christian content, of course, by, well, thank you for specifying that you don't see Marquetta as a Christ-like figure. I think that was an important nuance. But the other thing is that, of course, the figure of the priest who appears in the opera is undermining that element. And in that regard, I would also say that I think it's very important you draw this parallel to Bach's Passions, which were definitely an important formal model for in Kaija Saariaho's approach to opera in general, or even furthermore, a counter model, as opposed she saw Bach's Passions as more interesting formal models than any operas from the classical period of from Bach's contemporaries. But I would also expand what you said by saying that while we were working on Innocence, she was also working on her opera Only the Sun Remains, which is a rewriting of two No plays from Japan. And I think what happened, the dramaturgy of No, which I was working on as well at the time, on a piece that was incidentally about school shootings in 2013. The dramaturgy of No, which is a form of passion play as well, I think is a stricter formal simile to what is happening in Innocence, because it is about collective and individuals that are trapped in the repetition of a trauma and are looking for not catharsis, but transformation and inner transformation and metamorphosis from not despite what the wound that has been inflicted, but through the healing of that wound. I think that is also a very important nuance in terms of shifting the narrative from this biblical subject to the individual psychology of the people in the collective that is being talked about in Innocence. And lastly, I think it is, in regard to no theater, I think it's also important to think of the timelines more fluidly, because I think it can be questioned whether there is a present tense in the opera. Now it is being presented as events happening and people remembering events, but I think that's a directorial choice, and that this piece can be represented as 13 people who are trapped in memories. For all we know, the wedding is also the representation of something that has maybe occurred in the past. And these different temporal levels, I think, are showing us people who are in the fashion of no theater. Everyone in the story of on stage in Innocence is trapped in their own hell, of which they cannot escape, which in Buddhist terms is this endless repetition of the same inferno. I can add a question mark if you want.
No, thank you so much, and I would love to know more details. It's only what I could find, right? So I didn't know about No at all. You kept it as a secret, this part of, so there was nothing about it in your conversation or anywhere else. But as for the times, maybe I disagree, because the wedding doesn't happen all the time. We do not return to the wedding. Wedding is a fact which is before us and people talking. So for stage time, it's a presence. Everything else happens in the narration, like evangelist narrating about events happening before. That's why I did this.
Quick question for me. Do you think there's any point to asking why she referred to a fresco and not a painting?
That's a question to Alexei again, I think.
Well, I mean, I heard fresco and I thought, where are paintings travel, situated all over, unless they're enormous ones. Yeah. Frescoes are typically situated in sacred spaces. Frescoes typically have a narrative component such that what you see portrayed, I'm thinking of Masaccio, Michelangelo, Giotto, you see events portrayed in time, even though you take in the representation all at once. Mm-hmm. And that may have some analog to the opera itself, in which it's in time, partially out of time, but at the same time, we recognize it's a single event, trauma that is reflected to us through the aftermath and then the current day wedding. But maybe just fresco was just first thing that you thought of.
Thank you so much for this question. I have kind of three answers. First of all, now what I know that other frescoes were discussed, I should somehow, process this, because I don't know. I thought that was the fresco which she thought about. Second, now the scholars prove that it's not fresco. Of course, it's not painting as well, but I mean, his technique was different. He just comment. he painted it on a dry wall, not fresco technique.
Exactly.
Yeah, but in my opinion, if the extraordinary experience was not of the apostles there, but the viewers, like here, the fresco is something that bigger than ours. Of course, any painting, especially the classical, the masterpieces, they're bigger, but it also involves space. And I could argue probably that to the space, even in the best museum, where you're in the crowd of students, and the space in such a places make different kind of extraordinary experience. Maybe, I don't know. That's my idea.
Other comments, posings, questions?
Coffee.
Okay. Let's thank our